So there we are. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Today we're going to try to get through chapter 6 of Crossing. What we're talking about here really assumes a lot of knowledge on the part of the readers, of people having been to seminary, basically. So I will always try to, back up a little bit and remind us where we've been. But the main point that we're looking at is that, what Crossan is trying to do is to figure out how we have these two visions of God in Scripture. One being a violent God that is often appealed to by when people are trying to scare people into this, that, and the other thing, And having grown up in the Appalachian region, you certainly hear a lot of those sermons, right? About the God who curses and the God is going to damn and things like that. But the other is the vision, and Crossan is going to say is the vision that is much more authentic to the Jewish tradition of a God who's concerned with distributive justice. So the dichotomy is retributive justice or distributive justice. And Crossan's thesis is that the God of distributive justice is primary, that God's interest in, or God's push for justice is not just a command, but it is part of the character of God. Human beings, having been created in the image of God, thus also have as part of their character this not just a command towards justice, but the quality, essential quality of justice as part of our nature. However, and this is where Crossan talks less about original sin and more about what we might call an Enlightenment understanding that really stems from people like Rousseau and John Locke, but mostly that our systemic structures of society are what create this impulse towards violence. Now, that's a little bit, I'm pushing the envelope a little bit, but Crossan is not speaking so much theologically as saying that, civilization itself is the place where this punitive understanding of justice takes place. And he's looked at the first 11 chapters of Genesis and has tried to make the argument that throughout, God is not being punitive, but God is concerned, as we see from the beginning of creation itself, with distributive justice. So last week we left off at this slide on our PowerPoint presentation. We were talking about how in the book of Leviticus, there are certain places in the year where distributive justice can be emphasized. These are referred to as the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year. Any question? Okay, I thought I heard a question there. There is, I want to ask people to mute if you can, because I'm hearing an echo of myself. That's what it is. So, but this idea that, when the Israelites come into the land, lest they fall victim to, the trappings of civilization that were all around them. It could be the Hittites, it could be the Assyrians, the Sumerians, Babylonians, lest they fall victim to that. Remember, they are people who were chosen to represent, to emphasize and represent the quality and character of God in creation. And one of the ways to do that is to have periodic times in which you redistribute the wealth, because remember, the wealth is God's, and we as human beings are simply stewards of it. So throughout Leviticus, well, I should say in Leviticus 25, there is this emphasis on redistributive justice, because naturally what happens is that the trappings of civilization impinge upon us, and the monopoly game starts to get one-sided with one guy taking control of too much wealth. Well, hoping that that would not happen, there are certain stopgap measures that have been put in place. And so we want to move on and talk a little bit more then about this idea of covenant. Because Crossan does ask this question, and I'm not sure he answers it as satisfactorily as he could, but I'll nevertheless give you the question. What does it mean that creation in Genesis 1 never mentions covenant, while recreation in Genesis 9 emphasizes it strongly, but it interprets it strangely? So why do we have this idea of covenant in Genesis chapter 9 after there has been this destruction of the earth by water during the flood, but we don't see it as part of Genesis chapter 1? And what Crossan is going to do is he's going to get into the matrix, the web, the cultural web into which, this group of people known as the Israelites are trying to establish a sense of identity for themselves. Remember, they're writing their scripture, and they're doing it at various points in their history. And this is the place that I'd like to remind you of our conversation last time, because Crossan really assumes that you know this fairly well, and he should not. Because, but if you remember, last time we talked about the structure of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And we said, and I'll just go over briefly, we said that if you were to read that text very carefully, you would see at least, well, let's talk about Genesis then. You would see at least 3 authors or 3 perspectives that are coming through with various nuances, For example, the Yahwist tradition, which was written around 950 of the Common Era, uses the name Yahweh exclusively for God. And we said that that was a tradition that was written probably during the time of Solomon's reign in the southern kingdom of Judah. The 10 tribes in the north wrote their own tradition called the Elohist tradition. And scholars refer this as E, because exclusively they refer to God as Elohim. Over time, these 2 traditions are combined together and come into the southern kingdom after the northern kingdom is destroyed by Assyria. Now remember this name, Assyria, because this is the source of the problem, says Crossan. And I can't even begin to tell you just how outlandish their terror was in the ancient Near East. But let's look at the year. The year is 722. The northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians. Judah, however, is spared, and they become a vassal of Assyrian kings with names like Sargon I, Sargon II, Ashurbanipal, and Shalmaneser. All of these just crazy kings. But the way they kept themselves safe is they would enter into these suzerain/vassal treaties. So the suzerain, the king, would come down and say, this is what I expect of you. Based upon our long history together, you must give obedience to me and pay taxes and all those kinds of things. Well, as this is going on, as Assyria is attacking the northern kingdom, and shortly thereafter, there's another tradition that's being written. It's called the Deuteronomous Tradition, or D. And then after the Babylonian captivity, or during that, there's yet another tradition called P, written by priests who were, trying to keep the people alive, basically, during the Babylonian tradition. And if you read the Old Testament, as I tried to demonstrate before, and you were to color code, the books of, the first 4 books, you would see strands of literature written by each of these authors. The Yahwist, 950, Elohist, 850, priestly tradition, probably around 550 to 450 BCE. And then there was a guy, a redactor, who put all these together. But you notice I didn't say much about the Deuteronomist. The Deuteronomist, the tradition of Deuteronomy was written at a time in Israel's history that was very, very precarious. And I want to tell you a little bit about that because it plays a primary role in what we're going to talk about today. But lest I start moving on into my own, theological babble, let me stop and see if there are questions that you have or comments you would like to make. I see Kathy has joined us and Constance. Anne, yes. Any questions about the documentary hypothesis that, or these four strands of tradition give us insight? And if you isolate these strands, you get insight into the theology of the time. All right, I will assume that's a no. The two traditions we're going to focus on right now are the priestly tradition and more specifically the Deuteronomic tradition. Remember that priestly tradition, even though it was written much later, it is the tradition out of which Genesis 1, the creation story, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that was written by priests during the Babylonian captivity. And it was written as a hymn to try to keep the people of Israel, who are now being called Jews in Babylon, people of Judah, trying to keep them affirmed in their faith, trying to keep them hopeful that God had a plan in the midst of all of this. And the theology of the priestly tradition is very, very cosmological. God is not, Yahweh of the garden walking around in the dew of the day, but God is the grand architect of things. And as the grand architect, there is a plan. That gave great hope to the people living under the stress and the oppression. They weren't enslaved, but they weren't necessarily first-class citizens in Babylon. The priestly tradition was the way that the priests tried to keep the people in Babylon, the Jews in Babylon, hopeful of a return, that God was working through their experience. The theology is very cosmological. Well, prior to that time, prior to the Babylonian captivity, there were a series of kings between the years 722 and 609 BCE. Remember what's happening. The northern kingdom has been destroyed. Assyria is at the top of the game. They control the whole of the ancient Near East. They reign by terror. So the way that Judah was able to stay alive was to enter into some sort of agreement with the Assyrians. Hey, don't kill us, But what was happening at that time is that there were a series of kings, and let's just start from about 650 or so. You have Manasseh, who was a bad king. Actually, he started about 690 to 650, and he basically just gave away the whole farm of Judah to the Assyrians. Then briefly, he had a king by the name of Amon. And then when Amon dies, he leaves a son in the Davidic tradition by the name of Josiah. And Josiah becomes a child king. And this is the opportunity that the priests have to, after living through a bad reign of Manasseh for so many years, to try to bring up a king in their theological tradition. So there are scribes at this time that are trying to emphasize the importance of obeying God's law, that God brought you into this land, and if you obeyed God's law, if you sacrificed the way you were supposed to, if you followed the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, God would bless you. But if you didn't, God would curse you. And that was the dichotomy that was being set up at this time. And it's known as the Deuteronomic Tradition. And this is when the whole book of Deuteronomy was written. the entire book of Deuteronomy. And there was a little bit of kind of political theater that took place around this, because one day the priests were kind of cleaning out the closets of the temple, so to speak. And lo and behold, they come across this text, which is the diary of Moses from, 500 years earlier, 600 years earlier, coming through the Sinai desert, over the 40 years. So if you read the book of Deuteronomy, it's told from the perspective of Moses. Interestingly, Moses writes of his own death, which creates some problems there, but they weren't quite thinking of that. So, but all of a sudden, the finding of this text creates this new emphasis on the importance of following the law. And it's at this time, from about 620 to 609, during the reign of King Josiah, that much of the ritual that we know about associated with Judaism today is established. You must observe the Passover at the temple, right? You must observe the Day of Atonement, and all of the rituals that we know. These become so central to the Israelite tradition. Well, unfortunately, King Josiah dies in 609, and it's not long before the Babylonians come and take away the people of Judah for about a 50-year period of time. But that raises a really interesting question for them, right? Their theology, the book of Deuteronomy was telling them, if you follow God's law, God will bless you. If you do not follow God's law, God will curse you. Okay, let's take a look at the events that have happened. 609, King Josiah is killed, and starting around 597, the Babylonians come into Judah, start taking away the upper class citizens, and eventually move the whole people from Jerusalem to Babylon. What is your theology? What's the conclusion of your theology there? You must have done something to deserve this, right? You must have done so. God is cursing you. This is the background that Crossan is assuming when he's writing, I think, a very brief chapter about these suzerain vassal treaties. And the point he wants to make is that when we look at the idea of covenant, and I wish I could show you the little diagram he shows, but God is a God who establishes law, and these treaties are written according to a certain type of model, a certain type of structure. So let's say, and the one he uses is the Hittite treaty, which precedes the Assyrians, right? The Hittite kings would come into a region and would want to ensure, let's say the year is 800, 900 BCE. It doesn't really matter because the structure is what we're looking at. But the Hittite kings would come into a region and want to assure that this region would be faithful to them. So they basically put together a treaty, this legal document that is observed and often will be written in stone. This is really where we get our reference, that's inscribed in stone, written in stone. And it would be raised in this thing called a stele. This is actually an Assyrian stele right here. It's got the picture of the king on it. And then on the back, there are various versions of this, but on the back, it would have this treaty that was written out. It would begin with a preamble, right? Talking about the greatness of the king and blah, 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 and it usually pretty brief. And then the history that the king had with this particular region or this particular group of people, how wonderful he had been to them, and had been their protector in so many things. And then you would get to the point where a law would be established. Because of my past actions, my gracious past actions with you, here's what I expect from you. And then you would go down the law. And this goes all the way back actually to the Code of Hammurabi around 1700 BCE, the Babylonians. I guess maybe Mac can speak to this, or Lynn. When you go to law school and you're studying the history of law, do you begin with the Code of Hammurabi? Or do you just kind of get right into, no?
No.
Well, let me give you a little background on your profession here. No, but this is foundational for the law, and it was moral law, right? It was probably closer to what we would think of in terms of the Catholic tradition, because of the gods have shown their grace upon this particular king, and if you want to be party to that grace, then follow these commandments, follow these emphases or these laws that will keep you in his good graces. If you are to break one of these, and here's where you get to the fourth part of the model, if you are to break one of these laws, then there, as you might expect, there are going to be certain sanctions, certain types of consequences that you're going to have to endure. Now, Crossan is making the point here that these suzerain vassal treaties made two different emphases. He introduces the Hittite model because he claims that the covenant that God makes with Noah after the flood is built primarily, or is modeling this Hittite structure that we see. The emphasis in God's covenant that he makes with Noah is on God's past history. I'm the Lord your God who created the earth, I will never destroy the earth again. And if you look at that first covenant, there is nothing to do with sanctions. It's not, I will give you this covenant, and unless you break it. So Crossan wants to make the point that this is a model that the Jewish community and the priestly community, when they're writing about covenant in the Babylonian captivity, they want to ascribe this to their understanding of God. So priests writing during the Babylonian captivity or shortly thereafter, when they think about how God makes a covenant, they draw on this Hittite model. No emphasis on sanctions whatsoever. Do this, or there's going to be hell to pay. And I want to say right here, this is how Crossan is going to set up the distributive justice versus the retributive justice model. What the priests are essentially saying is that our God, writing a covenant based on the Hittite model, is a God of distributive justice. We might also say that this is how the dichotomy of law versus grace gets set up, that runs all the way up through the New Testament up into Paul. Is God a God of law that demands obedience, or there will be sanctions, or is God a God of grace, right? And to use that terminology, what we might say here is the priestly tradition, and writing about that covenant made, where we get the rainbow and God's promise. It is literally a promise. Not, do this and then I'll do this and I'll do this, but it's a promise. Look, I created this world. I care for it. I will never destroy it again. That is the model of grace. That is the model of distributive justice, which harkens all the way back, or I should say is consistent with the theology that we find in Genesis chapter 1, also written by the priestly authors. Now, I know this is terribly complex, and I'd like to ask you if you can find the place in your book. I was unable to make a slide because I couldn't create arrows. I don't know how to do that, but I'll have to figure out how to do that. But I think there is an image somewhere around page 95. No, there's one on 98, one on page 98. And what you will see right there in the middle of the page is that, that series of arrows with history on the left, law in the middle, then sanction on the right. And of course, this reflects that structure of the suzerain vassal treaty that would be made in the ancient Near East, the structure that serves as the model for how covenant is created in the Old Testament. What Crossan is saying is that when the law is established, the law is central here. But what's the purpose of the law? Well, the arrow can go one of two ways. In the Hittite model and in the priestly tradition, God's law is a lens by which you are able to revisit the history of God's grace, of God's distributive justice in the world. No emphasis on sanctions. There is going to be another model that is going to work completely differently, right? And that's the Deuteronomic tradition. The priestly tradition emphasizes distributive justice, God of grace. The Deuteronomic tradition that I'm about to talk about right here is going to be completely different. Why? Because their covenant model, the Assyrian model, was one that was very heavy on sanction. It was basically, try to think of a mafioso in Little Italy in New York, there's certain things that you've got to do. You've got to pay the, sorry, maybe I'm being too ethnic there, but you do these things, you pay your tribute, or a lot of things are going to happen to you, right? That's a different kind of covenant model. So let me stop right there, and hopefully you are able to see that history, law, sanction image on page 98, because it's very important to Crossan. Let me stop there. Are there questions or comments? I must be. Yeah, go ahead.
It seems, as I was thinking through this, that it hinges on, at least where Noah's story is involved, whether God caused the flood or it happened and he responded to people's needs to change with the rainbow.
Right.
In other words, if people who wrote that actually thought that God caused the flood, then that's very much a mark of retributive justice, right?
Yeah, and this is where I don't think Crossan really does a very good job. There's a line he says is that, but remember, they're trying to do the best they can with this Mesopotamian tradition, right?
Yeah.
Remember, they're drawing on stories to try to reflect their understanding of their God. And these stories, are from the Epic of Gilgamesh in its various versions. One of the Sumerian version, the gods destroy the planet because there's too much noise. But in the Hebrew version, God destroys the earth because there's too much violence. But then that sets up this catch-22. It's like the dad hitting the son. I told you not to hit your sisters. It's wrong to hit your sisters, that kind of thing. This God of violence, or this violent situation being used by this God who is apparently a God of grace. So what Crossan says, and I would like to hear anyone else's emphasis on this, is that God repents of this violence, almost as if, he was caught up, God was caught up in this violence itself. And after that repentance, makes this covenant and says, I will never do this again. I'm a God of grace. I don't know, I don't know what happened to me. The story isn't very consistent if you're going to try to emphasize the distributive God of justice. So what does Crossan say? And this is where he leaves it. Well, they were doing the best they could with the Mesopotamian story that they had. I don't think that that's very satisfactory myself. And boy, if I could come up with a satisfactory resolution to that problem, things would be great. But they're always going to come back to what you're saying, Sharon. Hey, God used violence, and if we're created in the image of God, then we must have violence, as sanctioned to us as well. Are there any other comments about this? Well, it looked like you're going to say something. No? Well, let me tell you a little bit then about the Assyrians. The Assyrians, I can think of no better word, were just monsters. It's amazing that they even made treaties because their military might was feared throughout, the ancient Near East. They came into towns with their army and they killed every living thing, basically. And they put their slaves or whomever, into that town. Women, children, old men, old women, you just did not stand a chance against the Assyrian army. They were that feared. And we have many examples, or relatively many examples, of these Assyrian steles, one of these being the image right here, that are set up throughout the land. This is basically like, yeah, we conquered this, and this is a memorial to that. And in case you ever want to cause any, any trouble, look at what the result is going to be. Now, this is the place where the covenant, the emphasis is less upon the history between the Assyrians and that whatever group of people they've conquered, and more upon the sanctions. Okay, more upon the sanctions. And this is the place, Crossan says, where we can come to understand what it is that the Deuteronomic history had in mind when they started to emphasize what the covenant between God and God's people looked like. And here, right in the middle of the Assyrian, empire itself, when the Deuteronomists are writing, and they are absolutely immersed in Assyrian culture and Assyrian law, as you might say, Assyrian treaties, it only makes sense that their understanding of covenant, remember, we've got to talk about this matrix that the writers are involved in. It only makes sense that their understanding of covenant is going to follow that model. And so when we look at the Deuteronomic covenant, it follows this blessing and curse, beginning in about, well, the emphasis in Crossan is around Deuteronomy 27, 28, and 29. And he makes a reference to this, this suzerain treaty, suzerain vassal treaty that was created for Ashurbanipal around 631 BC. This would have been precisely at the time that Deuteronomy was being written. The emphasis is heavily on sanction. And I'm going to try, I won't share my screen, but just read what Deuteronomy 28 looks like. And it's almost comical. I mean, this sounds like something out of Monty Python. I don't know if you've ever watched Monty Python, but they do sometimes a lot of comedy around, what some of these Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, these books of scripture look like. The blessing idea is found in Deuteronomy. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations and will bless you in such and such a way, right? But then you get to the converse of this, right? So you've got 14 verses that talk about the blessings that God will give if you obey. And this is Moses, according to Deuteronomy, speaking to the people in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula before they come into the land of Israel. But, says Moses, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all of his commands and decrees I'm giving you, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed. The Lord will plague you with diseases until he has destroyed you from the land and you possess. Then on and on and on, a full 50 or 60 or so verses filled with curses. He will bring upon you the diseases of Egypt. He'll bring upon you every kind of sickness and disaster not recorded in this book of law until you're destroyed. You who were as numerous as the stars in the sky will be left a few in number. And I'm just reading sporadically here. The most gentle and sensitive woman among you, so sensitive and gentle that she would not venture to touch the ground with the sole of her foot, will begrudge the husband she loves and her own son and daughter. The afterbirth from her womb and the children she bears. For she intends to eat them secretly during the siege and in the distress of it. This is crazy stuff. Women eating their afterbirth because of the curses of God. But excuse me, let me get back to my screen here. But this is not unlike what we find in these Assyrian suzerainty treaties, right? This whole, you can kind of see on this stele, appropriately phallic, by the way. You can see this on the stele, all this writing, right? This is just curse after curse after curse after curse after curse that will come upon any vassal who decides to brook Assyrian control. If that was the model that the Deuteronomists were using, and that was the matrix of a retributive type of culture in which the Deuteronomist author was writing, that it only makes sense, says Crossan, that that would be the lens through which, or the model by which they understood the God of Israel. And so what we end up with is a different type of covenant understanding. And this covenant understanding emphasizes sanction. Thus, we have, says Crossan, the two diametrically opposed visions of God. One that we find in Scripture that emphasizes God's grace. The other, also found in Scripture, that emphasizes God's retributive justice. And remember what he says, the retributive justice part of God comes from the matrix of civilization within which those texts were being written, but do not reflect the true nature of God. This is has been his thesis throughout. So his comment here, those Assyrian-style suzerain vassal treaties, with their heavy emphasis on sanction, curses, rather than history, and within sanction on curses or for infidelity instead of blessings for fidelity, are the contemporary metaphor, model, and matrix for the Deuteronomic vision of covenant. So that's how we've arrived at, this dual understanding of who God is. And he says you can see this throughout the Old Testament. This is the Deuteronomic theology. Obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings curse. Then Crossan does this wonderful thing, and I'll get into it here. But I want to stop and see if there are any comments or questions. I hope I'm not just leaving you all in a morass of confusion, because this is not easy stuff, I know. Okay. Well, what Crossan is going to do is he's going to say, you can see how the Deuteronomists and this Deuteronomic theology comes to emphasize the writing of the Old Testament, I should say. Not only did the Deuteronomists write the book of Deuteronomy around 620 or so, but also wrote what was known as the Deuteronomistic history or Deuteronomic history, which included Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. But later on, there was another set of books written around 400 or so called 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And what 1st and 2nd Chronicles does is try to place the Deuteronomic theology, or tries to correct the theology found in 1st and 2nd Kings, which emphasizes God's, emphasis of history and grace. Because if you believe the Deuteronomic theology that says that obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings curse, then you can use that as a lens to try to interpret history. But guess what? History doesn't bear that out. Just look at the history of some of the kings. If a king of Israel was doing a bad job and disobeying God, laying down and worshiping idols, and let's just think of the king named Manasseh, who ruled for about 40 or 50 years, around 690 to 640 or so. I think those were his dates. And he was a terrible king. He basically sold out all of the gold of Judah to the Assyrians. He bowed down to Assyrian kings. He was a nasty king. Well, if he was so disobedient to God, then why did God let him live for so long? That doesn't follow the Deuteronomic theology that obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings curse. In fact, it appears to be quite the opposite. Disobedience seems to bring blessing. On top of that, there's another king by the name of Josiah. And this was the young king that was as a child when he became king, and is considered one of the great kings of Israel with David, Hezekiah, and Josiah himself. He's the one that tried to promote all ritual and being centered on the temple in Jerusalem. That is still very prominent among Orthodox Jews today. And he's seen as a great king. Well, let's apply this Deuteronomic theology to him. If he was such a great king, then why was he killed in battle? Why did he have such a short life? And this is the place I just like to read where Crossan does such a good job. Because if we read the story in 2nd Kings, and what 1st and 2nd Kings does is give a kind of chronicle of all of the kings of Israel, all the way up to the Babylonian captivity, between Solomon and the Babylonian captivity. But if you read 1st Kings, this is what it says about Josiah. And I just want to make sure I'm in the right place here. Okay. All right. I'm on page 96. 2 Kings 23. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. So in other words, the Egyptian Pharaoh is going to go and fight the Assyrians, right? King Josiah went to meet him. But when Pharaoh Necho met him at Megiddo, he killed him. His servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. The end of Josiah, right? It doesn't seem to be a person who has been blessed by God, right? Killed in this silly way. Well, the person who writes Chronicles, who basically rewrites the 1st and 2nd Kings stories, has to write it from the perspective of Deuteronomic theology. Has to include some story where it says that Josiah must have done something wrong. And this is what we get in 2nd Chronicles about Josiah, and basically takes the 2nd Kings story and then adds commentary to it. King Necho of Egypt went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him, right? And then the editor But Necho sent envoys to him saying, what have I to do with you, king of Judah? I'm not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war. And God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God, who is with me, Necho, so that he will not destroy you. But Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but joined battle in the plain of Megiddo. So there's your Deuteronomic history. There's your Deuteronomic theology, right? Josiah didn't obey God, fought against Necho, who was fighting on behalf of God, and because of that was destroyed. And we see now, by the time we get back from the Babylonian captivity, with the Judahites, the Jews, there are two theological strands that we might say that are running through Scripture. And going back to that image that Crossan talks about with law in the center, one of those strands emphasizes history and the God of grace. The other of those strands emphasizes God's sanction if one disobeys. And we find this all the way up until, up into the New Testament. We could call it distributed justice versus retributive justice, or law versus grace, the God of grace versus the God who demands law. Before I want to talk about Job, because this is the place where it becomes so obvious. Are there any comments about this? Well, then let me talk about the book of Job, because there is a group of scholars in the Hebrew language after the Babylonian captivity who are writing against this Deuteronomic idea of God demanding obedience to the law, that God will reward you if you follow the law and curse you if you do not follow the law. The people writing this literature, or the literature, I should say, is known as wisdom literature. And the essence of wisdom literature is basically summarized in Job chapter 38. Like the will of God, the plan of God is mysterious and beyond human comprehension. But in order to get there, the wisdom authors draw upon a folk tale that they learned in Babylon about a guy who is overcome with, great adversity. And they build their theology into it. And what ends up happening, it ends up being a narrative between the Deuteronomic theology on the one hand, and this more priestly oriented God of grace and cosmological mystery on the other hand. And you know how the story goes, but now you have the lenses through which you can interpret this historically, knowing what the theological conflict was. Job is a man of incredible faith, and everything he does, it just simply worships God in every aspect of his life, from his rising in the morning to his going to bed. And because of this, and no, I shouldn't say because of this, Job's faithfulness was only, Job's faithfulness seemed to have been reflected also in the fact that God blessed him in so many ways. He had thousands of cattle and so much wealth and lots of sons and lots of daughters. Well, the story of Job starts out with a bet between God and Satan. First time Satan is mentioned in the Old Testament, by the way. And God says, hey, look at my servant Job. Isn't he great? And Satan, the accuser, says, well, of course he's great. You give him everything on a silver platter, but I'll make you a bet. I bet if you take everything away from him, he's going to curse your name. God says, you're wrong. And the rest of the story is about how faithful Job loses everything. And in the midst of this story, he has three friends come in, and they represent the Deuteronomic theology, right? Why is this happening to me, friends? What have I done? I've lost my family. I've lost my fields. I've lost my home. I've lost everything. I've got sores all over my body. what is happening? And each of these friends say, it's simple, Job. You did something to upset God, and God is cursing you for it. And Job, of course, says, I can think of nothing. I know I did nothing. So after the friends leave, there's a kind of a priestly, what we might say, a priestly conclusion to the book. And that, the essence of that conclusion is, look, I am a God of grace. You do not know my mind. The wisdom of God far transcends and exceeds anything that is comprehensible to humans. In fact, God kind of roughs up Job a little bit. In Job chapter 38, he says, who is this that darkens my door? You know, and with all of these complaints, where were you when I created the heavens and the earth? Notice that emphasis upon cosmology, God creating the heavens and the earth. When I set the stars in the sky, when I created Leviathan, when I created all the fish of the sea, where were you? And why do you even think you can question, you know, my majesty? Now God does, you know, he sounds kind of harsh here, but in the midst of it all, the emphasis is upon God's, you know, God's faithfulness to the world that God has created. And so it's kind of a morality play that tries to emphasize the silliness of this Deuteronomic theology. But as you know, even in Christianity, there are those who continue to insist upon a Deuteronomic kind of theology. If we even see it today, you know, in that little book called The Prayer of Jabez, right? If you do what is great, if you do what God, or in, you know, this health and wealth gospel, if you do what God expects of you, God will reward you. If you don't, God will curse you. Well, what utter silliness. You know, look at, you know, Oscar Romero, for example, probably the most godly person you can imagine, assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr., all of the people that we know who are paragons of virtue. That Deuteronomic theology does not work that way. It's civilization. Remember, coming back to civilization and its emphasis upon the need for violence, or I should say its fascination with violence, that attributes these characteristics to God himself. But what Crossan is trying to point out here, and I know there are many people who would think he's not doing a very good job of it, but you know, he's making a very, very compelling argument that the God of the Old Testament, right up to the point where we've come during the Babylonian captivity, has demonstrated God's self to be a God of distributive justice. Violence is the aberration here. So please, comments. I feel like I'm losing you all if I don't hear anything.
Well, Dan, we've all heard the old saying, you know, God works in mysterious ways.
Yeah, right, right.
Deuteronomy would say, no, there's nothing mysterious about it.
Right.
If you did something bad, you got punished for it. So, right. You know, as Crossan says, punishment, the fact that your life is going bad is the evidence that you are bad.
Yeah, right, right. And Job would say quite the opposite, right? Well, no, it's not a formula. It's not formulaic that way. And we as human beings want formulas. This is the foundation of all fundamentalism, isn't it? You know, give me the fundamentals. Why do I need the fundamentalists? So I can be blessed by God. And it just doesn't work that way. And it's almost an affront to God to try to place God in a box, because this actually comes back to one of the books of Plato. I think it's the Phaedrus, where is then God beholden to that law, right? Does God have, if the formula follows that good gets, that obedience is blessing and disobedience brings curse, then does God have to follow that law? And if so, then that means that there's something higher than God. Can God break the law? And some would say, well, but that's the thing. And this is one of the reasons why many people say you don't need God, you just need a law that is consistent, right? Because, you know, if there is a law that even God has to follow, then why do you need that God? All you need is the law that even God has to, you know, abide by. That's how Plato tried to address the situation. But in this case, you know, God is a law unto God's self, but in the essence of that law is this idea of grace and distributive justice. What Crossan is trying to get across. Now, next week, we get to look at the prophets who will also give us their own take on this. You know, you might remember Amos, who says, you know, I despise your solemn festivals. I despise, you know, all of the sacrifices you make in the temple. I don't want burnt offerings. Or Micah, what I want is to do justice and love mercy and to walk humbly with God. You know, there were other formulas that people were placing around worship in the temple in early Israel. That if we, you know, simply sacrifice to God the right way, there will be these results. And the prophets are going to be the ones who are going to, you know, really challenge that idea. So that's where we are here at 1 o'clock. This is a highlight of my week in many ways. I just love talking about this, and I just hope we're all on the same page and you're getting something out of it as well, because it's not easy. This is not easy stuff, I have to say. Any other comments before we go? All right. Yeah.
Dan, I just want to tell you, just because I don't ask a question doesn't mean I'm not interested, because I am. This is fascinating.
I know. I just have this sense that I talk too much, and, you know, if people want to have a good conversation, I don't want to be standing in the way of that. So, but I appreciate you saying that, Jean.
Well,
Anyone else?
it's true.
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Oh, just one comment. The Hittites almost come out of this being nice guys. I've never heard that before. I don't think of the Hittites as nice guys, but
Well,
that's a really interesting thing to think about.
right. Any of the peoples that you find, especially in Joshua, Deuteronomy, and places like that, they don't come across as you know, they're the pagans. They're the ones that are leading Israel astray. But the Hittites are good guys when compared to the Assyrians. In fact, I think it would be a tie for brutality between the Assyrians and the Nazis of 20th century Germany. These people were just brutal. They took joy in massacring people. So anyway, but on that happy note, I'm going to stop my share here. I remember how to do that. There we go. And I will see you all.
Thank you, Dan.
All right.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank
See you
you.
later. Bye.